Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to see all of you gathered here today for our session on securing peace and stability in the Asian century. A rather large agenda for a one-hour session here at Davos, so we shall try and cover all points as much as we can in the next hour or so. It comes, of course, on the back of two major speeches in the last 2 days here at the World Economic Forum, one by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, one by Politburo member from China, Liu He, both of whom talked about the need for more cooperation, global trade, investment and so forth. We've also heard a voice coming out of the United States at cabinet level, which has spoken of the possibility of tariffs being imposed on goods from Asia in the near future. So two slightly contradictory messages have come as part of that, and it feeds into our big question for today, which is, in this early 21st century world, are the economic imperatives and the security imperatives of the big powers, United States and China and India, but also of the medium powers, the ASEAN powers and the emergent powers in the region, no longer the same? This comes, of course, on the eve of the upcoming ASEAN-India summit, and it comes at a time when the question of strategic rivalry versus economics may be an opposition that we have to start seeing. It comes at a time when a whole variety of new regional organizations and networks are being formed. We'll say more about that in just a moment. And also, and not to be ignored by any means, that at a time when questions of security relate not just to international relations and nuclear tactics, but also, of course, of mass violence within countries, refugee crises, ethnic uprisings, and so forth, which also, of course, remain a very constant part of the way in which the region has to define itself. Now, before we get to our distinguished speakers for today and discussion, I want to just illustrate the point, if I may, by using this very splendid graphic which the World Economic Forum has put together to illustrate the rapid change in these areas. We start with, at least I hope we will start. I wonder if we could flag up map number 4.1. Splendid, thank you so much. We start with a map that in a sense dates back something like 70 years, the Cold War framework of US alliances in the region, still standing, perhaps a little weaker than they might have been just a year or so ago, but still very much there. But then we rapidly move to map number 2, if I may. In which we see, again, one of the products originally of the Cold War environment, the ASEAN gathering organization of 10 Southeast Asian nations, originally set up, of course, in a smaller form as an anti-communist bulwark back in the 1960s, now, of course, containing plenty of countries which are themselves communist, like Vietnam, and a rather different purpose in the region. Then, as we move to map number 3, we see one of the newer organizations on the bloc, that may be spelled BLOC, because of course Russia and China are both involved with this, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's sometimes been said that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a sort of defense and trade set of agreements between, hatched up really in Beijing and Moscow, is a little like the Holy Roman Empire, because none of the words in it is necessarily actually accurate. It's not based in Shanghai, it doesn't always cooperate, and it's not always terribly organized, but it may yet be changing as the region changes around it. We then move to number 4. In which we see here one of the trade-driven organizations, or concepts, you might say. This is RCEP, the Regional Common Economic Partnership, very much pioneered by China, which you see at the top there, as an answer to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big trade agreement now, of course, in a rather different form that emerged during the Obama administration. And this is China's equivalent or attempt to answer that in terms of a regional trade agreement. Now, with the TPP losing the United States as a member, this RCEP has a great deal more salience in the present day. We then switch to the 5th map. And again, we there have the TPP miraculously reconstructed. In fact, this week you will have seen that after Prime Minister Trudeau, who was just here, managed to sign off on some changes, the agreement to sign the agreement has now been agreed. And although the United States is not a member, we still have here 11 countries which are going to cooperate in this major new trade, free trade initiative. That, of course, speaking of trade, brings us to the narrative that has perhaps been singly most dominant in the region in the last 5 years. And that, of course, it's so large that I haven't used dots, we've used arrows. The Belt and Road Initiatives goes by many names: One Belt, One Road, also the New Silk Road. But we're essentially talking about the Chinese aspiration over the next 10 years to have something like $8 trillion worth of infrastructure placed within the region as part of a series of public-private investments, very much driven by an agenda from Beijing, but with the idea that this is China's plan to integrate trade and security issues from a Beijing-centered point of view. And I think we can actually just bring those all together with the final map. And you see how the different colored dots put together rather different maps and different weights behind the different parts of the Asia-Pacific region. And we will be discussing how some of those either come together or diverge. Before we move on to that, though, we will just show one last image, and that relates to the last topic I mentioned, the question of security and mass violence. And although Asia has been broadly quite a calm place in the last 25 years or so, it is worth remembering quite how many incidences of mass violence have grown up, have emerged in the region, suddenly blowing up, often without very much notice. I wonder if we could play that video. It's a rather sobering map of the last 30 years, and well worth remembering if one holds to the not entirely inaccurate conventional wisdom that Asia has basically been a region of peace and stability in the post-Cold War era, a reminder that trouble is never far away. Well, if we're looking for trouble, then I think we have the three right people to lead us and guide us either around it or possibly through it. May I introduce our speakers today? MJ Akbar is Minister of State for External Affairs of the Government of India. He is actually a man who has worn many hats, so to speak. He was a very distinguished journalist in India for many years on papers such as The Telegraph, the very well-known news magazine India Today, but then, as it were, turned to the other side of politics and has become a distinguished public servant in that particular role. In the middle, we have Mr. Abul Hassan Mahmood Ali, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Bangladesh. He has served in ambassadorial capacity to many countries, including Germany and the United Kingdom, and now holds the political role at the top of the Foreign Ministry in Dhaka. And on the left from where I'm sitting, Professor Mari Elka Pangestu, who is now a distinguished academic. Perhaps that gives her a bit more peace and quiet. But for more than a decade, she served in high office for the government of Indonesia, serving first of all as Minister of Trade between 2004 and 2011, and then as Minister of Tourism until the year 2014, before stepping down from government. And amongst many other distinctions, she was also a candidate for the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization. So there is no doubt when it comes to questions of trade and how it operates that she's an extremely well-qualified person to speak to us. And before we start a more open discussion, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to give us 6 or 7 minutes of their thoughts on some of the issues that are facing us in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region when it comes to questions of economics and security. And Mr. Akbar, I'll start with you. India, of course, one of the so-called Quad, along with Australia, Japan, the United States, big powers, which are having to rethink their role in the region, particularly in the context of China's rise. So I wonder if you have thoughts about how that can be managed and if we have a future of peace or something that perhaps is a little more worrying.
Thank you very much, Rana. Not so-called, simply called the Quad.
The Quad, yes.
Right. We're discussing Asia. Asia is a word with a curious history. It's a Greek word and began life as something called Asia Minor. And it's taken a couple of thousand years before Asia is recognized as Asia Major. But now I think we can be quite confident that Asia is Asia Major, now that Asia has arrived in Davos. So, but I made this point purely to describe how nomenclature can actually derail discourse. And we must really, truly begin to understand what we are talking about when we use the words we use. I'll give you just one example, because we have brief. there in the map there is the Middle East. Somebody should ask, what is the Middle East in the middle of? If you actually want to know what the middle of Asia is, it's India. And it is, I will argue, I think perhaps a little later, that India is the pivotal power of Asia in this century. And what happens there will determine whether the phrase that we are using of the 21st century as an Asian century will become a fact or not. This is not to discount the role that major powers like Indonesia or China and others played, not at all. But I will try and explain why India is the bridgehead nation of the emerging world. Now, if this remark of that it is in the middle was merely a curiosity of geography, it wouldn't be worth the few words we spent on it. But this is a geopolitical position that I am talking about. The second point as a preliminary that I would like to make, since we are going to discuss security and we're discussing tensions that lead to so much conflict, one of the most mature relationships in Asia, and I use the word advisedly, is the relationship that has developed between India and China. In 2003 and 4, the trade between the two countries was, I think, was certainly less than $1 billion. Today it is around 70 billion. And this is given the fact that the longest border dispute that India has is actually with China. But as two nations, and we don't agree on everything, nor is there any requirement to, but as mature nations which recognize that the principal objective of nation building must be the prosperity of their people, and not simply prosperity for the sake of prosperity, but shared prosperity, egalitarian prosperity, an egalitarian prosperity that is both vertical demographically and horizontal spatially. That this shared prosperity is not going to emerge alongside conflict. And therefore, in what have we actually done, whether we call it a doctrine or we don't call it a doctrine, is a very conscious effort on both sides not to allow differences to become disputes, and certainly to prevent disputes from becoming conflicts. We had a very good example of that in recent time, and I think this is actually a model which large parts of the world might want to follow. Now, what has happened here, as Rana has already mentioned, is that as the pressure rises from the aspirations of the people below and eventually reaches even the deafest government, as the pressure rises, people understand that cooperation and cooperation across nations and across regions is really the way forward. We in India truly believe, this is definitely an old saying about knowledge, that knowledge is the one thing that grows when you give it away. And today, prosperity is also grows only when you share it. If prosperity becomes an exercise in greed, as our Prime Minister put it in his now very now even renowned speech, if it becomes an exercise in greed, it is limiting. It doesn't work. And this shared prosperity is really the objective. Now, the Prime Minister left Davos yesterday at 4 o'clock because he had to reach Delhi. Why? Because for the first time, all 10 heads of government of ASEAN are going to be in Delhi. Beginning today, when their arrivals have started, and as you were mentioning earlier. Now, this itself is a very, very exciting moment in the development of partnerships and in the development, in the search for shared prosperity, where India is becoming closer to South Asia, so to Southeast Asia, and this good equations that we are developing. And do remember that while we look at conflict zones today to the west, which are in turbulent times. That when ASEAN began, it was the whole of East Asia that was riven by war. The Cold War may have been very cold in Europe, but it was very hot in Vietnam. And despite that, nations emerged. They found a rational way forward. Now, why did I say that India is a pivotal power? Because you see, if you stand in Delhi and look east, you will find a range of countries which have different faiths, different demographic dynamics, and so on and so forth. But by and large, exceptions apart, we can say that there is one thing in common, that all the nations are looking for a greater economic growth and growth for their people. And if you look west, you will find, for a variety of reasons, conflict zones. We are very proud of the fact that we have great friendships in the Gulf, and we have now an extraordinary partnership to the east and through ASEAN and so on and so forth. But the challenge to prosperity comes through conflict. And the biggest symptom of contemporary, the biggest danger in the conflict area is from terrorism. And this, India becomes the frontline nation in the fight for security, as well as in the great aspirational struggle for prosperity. And this is really which makes the Indian experience very important. I don't want to exceed too much of
but we'll continue those points, very, very useful points in discussion, Minister. So thank you very much for laying out such a clear agenda to start with. Because you mentioned the India-ASEAN summit, which is in fact going to kick off very, very shortly, it seems sensible, if I may, to turn next to Professor Pangastu, who, of course, has served as a minister in one of the key ASEAN countries in the shape of Indonesia. ASEAN is also an organization that has had to change its role rather significantly in the past couple of decades. Where do you see at the moment the possibilities and the tensions and difficulties in terms of the way forward, and where does Indonesia stand as part of that?
Thank you. First, I'd like to make three basic points, I guess. I think the first point, what is the link between peace, stability, and economics, which you posed at the beginning, and what does it mean for the Asian century? I think the history of the formation of ASEAN was actually security. You know, we got together to face a common security concern, and that created peace in the region. And so in ASEAN, we always talk about the importance of the peace dividend to allow us to prosper economically. So there's definitely a relationship. And then in the last 2 decades, you've heard of this notion, the peaceful rise of China. You know, as China economy became much more developed, China wanted to appease its neighbors, including ASEAN, that, you know, don't worry, you know, we're going to rise together and peacefully. So shared economic prosperity is part of ensuring peace and security, you know. So it's kind of like going both ways. And that's actually the main reason why China then proposed the China-ASEAN FTA. So this was just to link the security issue with the economic agenda, and how it led to a lot of the economic integration that is happening in the region. And after the China-ASEAN FTA, then the other dialogue partners followed, including India, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, which is part of the so-called Indo-Pacific, which has become the new jargon of today. We haven't heard Indo-Pacific for a while, but the last 6 months, I think Indo-Pacific has become trendy again. So I think this is a continuation, a continued dance between peace and economic prosperity. And within trade, that's definitely still an issue, including in the way we have relationships with the US, and then the issue of the South China Seas and how that plays into the economic agenda and so on. So I think that's the first point I would make, and I think that's going to be a continued dynamic changes that will happen. The second point I wanted to make, which is kind of more a trade perspective, is that, you know, East Asia prospered tremendously in the last 3 decades, especially because we had an open and rules-based multilateral trading system with the advanced countries taking a leadership role. Now that you have a retreat of the advanced countries, in the so-called open and multilateral rules-based trading system. What is the role for Asia? You know, this is, I think, started the last 2 years we've been discussing, well, I guess since January 2016, we have been having this conversation the moment Mr. Trump pulled out from the TPP and did not want to ever mention the word multilateral or WTO in any of the G20 statements, and so on. And then Xi Jinping's speech last year, and then Modi's speech this year, and you mentioned the Chinese high official mentioning it again this year. So is there a role for Asia? You know, Asia's been not really taking a leadership role in terms of the openness of the trading system and the WTO. But so is there a role for Asia now? And then when you talk about the role of Asia, then you talk about, you know, do we want, we always have this dilemma about who is the leadership in the region. Is it China? No, we don't want dominance of China. We want shared leadership. Is it China? Is it India, Indo-Pacific? Is it ASEAN? I think at the end of the day, it has to be shared leadership. So I think we are grappling with what's the kind of combination of trade agreements that would make, you know, in trade we have this analogy that, you know, as long as the bicycle of openness is continuing to move, you have some hope. If it stops a standstill, then you got no hope, right? So the multilateral is stalled. So the next best thing is actually mega regionals, not small regionals, but mega regionals, right? So the mega regionals that are involving all these countries are really the TPP, and only one has, well, none of them have the US in it, by the way. TPP, US was in it, but now -1, right? You only have TPP, which is 11, and then you have RCEP, which does include India. TPP doesn't include Indonesia or India, and RCEP includes India. And then you have, which is ASEAN plus the 6. And apparently Pacific Alliance is also making outreach to Asia Pacific. So this is what we call in the trade world variable geometry. Which one is going to work out? I think RCEP makes sense because it does have India in there. And the only one that has the US, but it is not a trade agreement, is APEC and EAS. And the only one that has India and the US is EAS. APEC does not have India in it, even though we would like to have, some of us would like to have India in there. But, you know, so EAS is really a dialogue forum, part of the ASEAN, which is the only one that can have the US in it. So I think we're in the world where we would, the US doesn't want to play with us. I'm trying to make a playground comparison. They don't want to play with us, so they're sitting in the corner, right? And the rest of us still want to play, and we still believe in all the good things about openness of trading system, the importance of the WTO with the dispute settlement, and so on and so forth. But the US is sitting it out. So how do you live in a G19 world, in a climate change minus US world, even though California and everybody else is still in there, some of the states are in there, but still engage the US? Right? And the balance of the relationship, China versus the Indo-Pacific, and to close with the China-ASEAN summit, which is very important signaling. And they talk about infrastructure building and what is it? Act East Asia? Act East Asia, I think that's what it's called. Infrastructure building, just like the BRI, the Belt and Road. And the fact that our president is making a 4-country visit to South Asia. You know, he's going to India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, as well as Afghanistan on this trip.
Thank you, Professor van Gusten. I think that story of regional dialogues and regional movements that go beyond the sort of shaking and rumbling of the big powers is a story we're hearing a lot of here at Davos this week, and actually we'll be hearing a lot more of in months and years to come. And that brings us very neatly to the question of Bangladesh and the minister, because Bangladesh has become known for a whole variety of things. One, of course, is the way in which dealing with this issue that we see in front of us here, the question of its role in peacekeeping operations, but also, perhaps more tragically, in recent weeks and months, the current Rohingya crisis, in which Bangladesh has obviously had to take a very active role as refugees flee across the border from Myanmar, has put these issues very centrally in the frame in Dhaka as well. So, Minister Ali, I wonder if we might ask you to reflect on these issues for 7 minutes or so.
Thank you, Professor Rana, for setting the context, possible scenarios, and the challenges facing our countries. Asia Pacific is in tumultuous times. It's often difficult to foresee or anticipate within the complex geo-economic and geostrategic settings. Many of the givens on which we base our growth or positioning within Bangladesh or South Asia or beyond can suddenly get jolted. Bangladesh saw that up close, as you have said already, in the past 5 months as the Rohingya crisis unfolded along our border. For many reasons, this one issue merits our attention as we reflect on peace and stability. Rohingyas is not an issue of survival of over 1 million ethnic people. By no means northern Rakhine state is another faith-based civilizational fault line between Muslims and Buddhists. Responding on Rohingya issue tested Bangladesh. In spite of not being a party to 1951 convention, refugee convention, we reached out in response to utter humanitarian necessities. On a larger canvas, we must not shy away from confronting certain probing issues. Yes, every state would remain conscious of its political sovereignty, but in exercising sovereignty and governance of the state, no segment or community can be excluded and disenfranchised. Such an issue has to concern the entire international community. When you speak of peace and stability, we must connect and unpack in practical terms the actual realization of quote unquote no one to be left behind. This is something that our leaders unequivocally agreed to in Agenda 2030. Globally, we agreed to place people at the center, essentially not below the states. It is a fundamental shift that is evident across new development architecture. It is necessary that it gets equally accepted and translated across national, regional and global architecture of political governance. Peace, harmony, stability has to be recognized as integral to national development and of all people. Every responsible state must value and engage with all small and marginal population, people in vulnerable situations equitably in full mutual trust and respect. If one state falters, an apparently small local issue can rapidly challenge much wider geography and population beyond the specific people concerned. So, when the Rohingya people landed like a tsunami on Bangladesh border and coast beginning end of August 2017, frankly, we were overwhelmed and faced difficult choice as a country severely resource constrained and many limitations. Our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina reached out to them out of our moral ethos and out of our own history. When 10 million of our people went to India, the people and government of India gave us full support, sympathized with us. In 1971, as our people had no other place to go to. So, we stood by a population, talking of the Rohingyas, in extremely precarious circumstances within our constraints and limited means for the time being. There are much larger questions and issues for our neighborhood and the Asia Pacific to look if we are to truly demonstrate our commitment to peace, harmony, stability around us. This one issue indeed challenges us to illustrate quote unquote shared responsibility. Now, the Rohingya population in that area, in the two Upazila sub-districts in English of Cox's Bazar district in the southeast of Bangladesh, has overtaken the local population. Hundreds of acres of precious forest land had to be given away to host around 1 million Rohingyas there. As we look ahead in a longer frame, Bangladesh made a choice, not just a strategic choice in terms of engaging with and expanding our friendship with India. In fact, we have the best of relations now with India since the independence of Bangladesh at the end of 1971. Moving towards engagements at political, economic and people's level, both our countries, Bangladesh and India, underscore that ties and engagements be premised on mutual trust and mutual respect, irrespective of diversity in size and asymmetry in capacity and endowments. Equally important would be adherence to the principles of open and inclusive cooperation, sharing of benefits, securing win-win outcome out of collaborative engagements like we have done in case of settlement of our maritime border, and also settling the long-running problem of the enclaves in each other's countries. In fact, when Prime Minister Modi went to Bangladesh in June of 2016, he, in his public speech, he said that if this kind of settlement had occurred in some other place on the western part of the world, then it would have there would have been a row to give prizes and accolades and so on. But okay, so since this has happened here in this corner of the world, so nobody says anything. So this is a major achievement for for India and Bangladesh, and I think people should be aware around us in our area and the rest of the world. Then we must get clear about competition or economic coexistence. In an interdependent world and intensifying Asia-Pacific, replete with intricate web of supply chains and value chains, every nation must recognize crucial significance of securing peace, harmony, stability, and eventually prosperity. Then how do we move and balance between state and people? Emerging global norms and compacts dictate to realize that no individual is to be left behind. Lastly, securing peace, harmony, stability, prosperity is equally a regional and global responsibility. Yet often we do see a tendency to weigh issues and circumstances through security and sovereignty prisms. I believe it is time that we take a much wider and rational view of security and sovereignty and bring the necessary balance vis-a-vis much deeper economic interests that beckon us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister Ali. And I may, if I may, I'm going to take up a couple of the core themes that came through what all three of you had to say, and then bring something back into discussion, which will then turn into a discussion which I hope our audience here will join in with in just a few minutes as well. Listening to what all three of you had to say, I was given actually a relatively positive and in some ways very cooperative view of the Indo-Pacific region, if we're going to call it that. And I think actually in many ways that's very accurate and it's rather reassuring. From what Minister Akbar said, the talk about a mature relationship with China, it's an interesting adjective, I think, because it's not quite the same perhaps as warm or friendly or enthusiastic, but it suggests that both sides have weighed each other up and know what the agenda is. With Professor Pangastu talking about the view from ASEAN and what some people have called the alphabet soup of different organizations, which don't seem to have any, it's a bit like one of those games of cards where you have to sort of match the different dots, and it's often hard to bring them together. From that, nonetheless, I heard a story about joining up those dots, literally in the case of the dots we saw on the maps perhaps, and trying to create a more integrated structure. And again, from Minister Ali, the story there again about a regional cooperation between Bangladesh and India, which hasn't been widely noticed, but actually needs to be seen as part of that rebuilding in the region. But I hope you will allow me the opportunity at this point to introduce a mild note of possible pessimism as well into the discussion, because it struck me that there are, of many points that we could bring up about the region, two that I think are worth throwing into the discussion at this point. First of all, we have taken the actions of the two major military powers in the region, and I'm being careful because of India being very much on the agenda here, but talking here about the United States and China. And I use the word major in the context here of having countries that seem to have some idea of a wider strategic framework of what they want to do. So in a sense, we've known about the United States' intentions for many decades, the building of a security alliance with partners, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and so forth, that have helped to also integrate and bring together economic cooperation in the region. One of the big questions now is whether the current administration, with perhaps a more jaundiced view of those arrangements, might significantly change the way that those operations operate. And again, in a minute, it'd be very, very good to have views on that. The second thought, of course, is about the role of China. It's good to know about mature relationships, it's good to know about trade relationships, but Indonesia, of course, is one of the countries that's party to the multi-state dispute with China over the South China Sea. It was adjudicated against China at The Hague just a couple of years ago. Of course, the discussions continue in the region, but there's no doubt that that issue of Chinese role and fortification in the South China Sea is something which is very much a presence in the region and is growing and seems unlikely to go away. The third point, if I may, is to pick up on something that Minister Ali said about morals and values. And again, that is a point that I think is really very interesting to bring into the discussion in terms of discussing security and shared values. 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about Asian values. As Minister Akbar pointed out, Asia is an artificial concept in the first place, so the idea of Asian values in some way also rather artificial. But many people have observed, despite the broad democratization of the region, and here we have representatives of 3 robustly democratic regimes in the region, there has been a sense that maybe some of the values, whether it's of shared community, of the idea of trying to work out problems by absorbing difference rather than highlighting it, in many countries, to some extent, the domestic politics of India, to do with bloggers and the question of internal disputes in Bangladesh, which have led to the deaths of at least some people who have spoken out on the internet, and more broadly speaking in the region, perhaps in places like the Philippines, a sense that shared values of greater liberalism as well as democracy, separating the two, are maybe frozen, in retreat, perhaps no longer a priority in the sense that they were. And that has an effect on the way in which a sense of common culture is brought together. So I wonder if I might take some of those points and bring them back to our panel to reflect on that. Professor Pangastu, could I start with you? China is the largest resident power, as it were, in the Asia-Pacific region. The United States is currently a little ambivalent, to put it perhaps at its most objective, in terms of the way in which it sees its role in the near future. What does that mean in terms of a country like Indonesia having to make choices about its own security position?
Well, I think if you take the South China Seas, which you mentioned as a case in point, Indonesia actually doesn't have any dispute with China on the South China Seas. But it has always tried to be neutral in the past. Trying, and the ones that have disputes is actually Vietnam,
Philippines.
Philippines.
But is Indonesia neutral about Chinese fortifications in the South China Sea?
Coming to that. So Indonesia, up to about 2 years ago, was very neutral. So we always, because we felt we have to be neutral to be able to play the kind of arbitration role, and we always try to push the position that China should not deal with ASEAN countries bilaterally. They have to deal with ASEAN as ASEAN. And that's why this code of conduct, while we are resolving the bilateral disputes, we need to have a code of conduct to be able to navigate in the South China Seas for economic and trade purposes. And then it stopped because of the Philippine arbitration case to The Hague and so on. And that actually made the Chinese retreat. No, we don't want code of conduct. We're going to go back to bilateral. And then we had all those disruption of the Cambodia ASEAN meeting and so on and so forth. And China became more aggressive, basically, in fortification of the rocks and so on. Mm-hmm. And they actually came into Indonesian economic zone territory. It was not a dispute of the border, but they came into our economic zone. And that's when Indonesia changed from not being neutral to becoming aggressive, right? So I think I think what we're trying to do now in ASEAN is to really establish the code of conduct, because I think it's really important to be able to resolve security disputes and not disturb the economics. Just like economic disputes, like in the WTO, you have the dispute settlement system, should not spill over to security.
And is the United States part of this picture at all, or is it essentially being written out of a story that's become more Asian?
At least for the South China Seas, the U.S. is not party to this even though in the past, actually sometimes the U.S. comes in and makes it harder for us. And you know, the Chinese have tried to use economics, as we know, to split ASEAN. And this is
Successfully,
the cohesiveness of ASEAN becomes another issue. Yeah, it was quite successful, but now we're trying to regain back. You know, try to get fight for the code of conduct at least.
Well, thank you, Professor Pangestu. Let me turn, if I may, to Minister Ali, because actually that leads quite nicely into drilling down into something that you said there about the India-Bangladesh relationship, and I'll turn to Minister Akbar in a minute on that too. One of the things that was said in the last 5 to 7 years was that Bangladesh was a prime target for the Chinese BRI initiative, and that Bangladesh was going to become part of the phrase string of pearls was often used. In other words, that Bangladesh might be absorbing more Chinese influence than perhaps its neighbor felt happy with. Is the very happy agreement you talked about with India at least a product of feeling more cautious about Chinese influence?
Well, I think this is self-evident. I don't have to argue or state the facts on the ground, because we have border of land boundary of more than 4,000 kilometers with India. And in fact, we have, of course, relations with India, with China, but you know, which one takes precedence, and that is for anybody to see. And I have already mentioned that we have resolved the problems in a way that should be a lesson for not only rest of Asia, but also for the world. So how two neighbors, in our case, of course, we share history, we share geography, religion, culture, language, music, drama, and everything. So therefore, maybe it was easier for us to come together, but that did not happen earlier. You know, it has been going on for a long time, the unresolved major problem. So the fact that it can be done, so that has been shown by the present leadership in both the countries. So this is the important part, that we must get together, we must come together, you know, for common benefit, for shared prosperity. We have started, you know, who could have thought that there will be like what we call border hearts. These are the markets at the border. You know, the people at the margin, at the border, on both sides of the border in India and Bangladesh, they were being called as, you know, like smugglers. And the same people are today, they have been given dignity because of the establishment of these border markets. So it has succeeded so much that you know, more and more people around the border, all along the border, they are asking for establishment of such border markets or hubs.
But is part of the motivation of that a desire not to be seen in the first place to be too close to the Chinese side, which at least from the outside appeared to be quite influential in Bangladesh in the last few years?
No, I think that perception will not be proper, because you know, this is all happening between Bangladesh and India, and therefore, since there is no common border, so that has to take its own place. It has its own position, own place, and I think these two are not mutually exclusive, and we can find a position for cooperation with China as well. And as my friend and brother, Mr. Akbar, Indian External Affairs Minister of State, has mentioned that the relationship between India and China is a mature relationship. So therefore, I think I quite agree with that. So I don't think there is any contradiction between our relations, our closest relations with India and our relations with China, or for that matter with any other country. For example, let's say with the Middle East, so on.
And Minister Akbar, you started in a clear and even provocative fashion, putting forward India as the pivotal country in the region. Isn't part of the issue, if we're going to follow that thought, that India now has to give a much clearer sense to the region of what it sees as its vision, not just in terms of its own bilateral interests, whether it's with Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, or others, but rather how it sees the whole region coming together? Do you think that India actually has that vision at the moment?
Well, Some of the evidence is there on the ground. It's happening today in Delhi with the presence of the ASEAN countries. It's part. Once again, the word that I would like to use is shared vision. And that really is the key word with Bangladesh. It's a shared opportunity. And may I make one point quite emphatically? The 21st century will not accept hegemony. This is going to be a century of sovereign nation states. And nation states that have emerged out of the embryo of history, colonialism, many other realities, whatever it might be. But each one will exercise its rights to sovereignty and independence. Now, this does not mean that all nations have equal capacities, obviously not. But it means that all nations have equal rights and indeed equal obligations. And common sense, you don't have to get a degree or a doctorate to know that cooperation is an outcome of common sense. And circles of cooperation are being created wherever possible at a speed which may be even described as unprecedented. The very number of in the alphabet soup shows you how many have emerged, including the latest one, which is the membership in SCO, and so on and so forth. Now, these circles of cooperation will intersect sometimes. Sometimes they will be separate, but each will search for a center of gravity, each will search for a periphery. I think one of the things that is going to be very important is that we have become so fixated on land as the central asset of our thinking. We're all land-based. The human being is land-based. We are going to start thinking that the three major deliverables of the 21st century are going to come from waters, from skies, and from space. And indeed, all waters and the sky and space, there are no boundaries. So the evolution of doctrines for these is going to engage us. And the Indo-Pacific waters idea that you see is a part of the search for that. One, shared space, shared waters, the equal good of all.
So that's a very, very positive view, but you use the words nation states, that the idea that there will not be hegemony, but hasn't one of the consequences of the rise of the nation state in the region, particularly in the last few years, meant a much stronger nationalism, often a very inward-looking and unfriendly kind? It's been stated about Japan, about India, it has to be said, about the Philippines, about a variety of countries that seem in some ways to be taking a much more exclusionary rather than cosmopolitan view of who they are and who their people are.
I'm very glad that as a member or citizen of the nation which had Brexit, you mentioned it.
Well, as a Bengali, we're natural cosmopolitans. We get worried about these things.
Don't decry nation states and exercise their national rights. National rights have, in fact, it is nation states which have created far more cooperation than empires. It's nation states which have reached out and created ASEAN without hegemony.
But when we look at the Rohingya crisis, doesn't it also create crises within countries?
Yes, you can look at problems. Is there anyone sitting here, indeed, in the whole of Davos, which believes that the world will not have problems? Some of inheritance, some of our creation. If there were no problems, there would be no Davos.
Well, that's the best justification I've heard for us all gathering here in that case.
I mean, there will be problems, but the ability to deal with them without sending invitations to hegemons or to outsiders.
Or to having wars.
To having wars. We are dealing with a situation since 1947,
But
nobody had ever solved this problem.
Yeah.
And they did it with two democracies, two parliaments.
Absolutely.
Uniting. In our parliament, very little unites our parliament. But Bangladesh did. So
and as I said, that I will repeat that this is a model for the world. And so therefore, you spoke of a little bit of pessimism.
Indeed.
So I think, yeah.
Someone
well,
had to.
I don't look at it that way, just like Mr. Akbar, that this is part of life. So if there was no, no difficulties, no barriers, then there'd be no life.
Ethnic cleansing and communalism can't just be part of life, surely. They have to be combated, right?
We have to come to terms with that. We have to resolve it. That's why I'm saying that people have to be given their rights. They should not be marginalized, even if they are a small community, I mean 1 million people, but they have their rights.
Not so
rights.
small.
So this is what we are trying to say.
And one of the things really that democracy engineers and sort of allows to come to the surface is this extraordinarily, what I think is one of the great positives of the world at this moment, despite the evidence against it, is the philosophy of pluralism. And in fact, I must stress that when I see the dangers of terrorism, it is that terrorists actually seek to destroy pluralism with the venom of fear, whether they do it in Holy Bakery, whether they do it in your country, or whether they do it in mine. And of course, there are elements, they do it in Britain, in Europe. But those of us who are very proudly represent civilizational values stand up and fight for what we believe in.
Well, it's a wonderful Davos moment to have a minister of the government of India speaking up for pluralism, and I think that's really very good to hear. Because we are at Davos, we probably have a whole bunch of people in this room who can solve all the problems we've just heard, maybe in the next 5 minutes or so. So I wonder if we could take some questions and comments to our panel and then come back. And do please tell us who you are when you ask a question. Microphone coming to you, sir.
Peter Draper from South Africa. I'm also co-chair of the Forum's Trade Council. So with Murray on that. So one of the missing areas of red on the map is the careers. So hopefully it won't become red. But I'm wondering, in this spirit of optimism, but also laced with a little bit of potential pessimism, how does the panel see that situation playing out? And then, since you've been talking about the Indo-Pacific, there is a structure in what's called the Indian Ocean Rim, which was created many decades ago. Africa is part of that. This is part of the Indo-Pacific construct. But that construct, the IOR, has been moribund effectively for many years. With this new emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, is the IOR going to be revitalized somehow? Where does Africa fit into this story?
Thank you very much. Very good question. I mean, again, I wonder if I might, well, perhaps the nuclear question, if I might just briefly turn to Minister Akbar for a thought on that, and then we'll go along the panel.
Which,
on the question of Korea.
We had actually the whole morning a special session on this, and I think Korea, there is another session also on this.
Fair enough.
But, I mean, we certainly express our concerns over this. And what we do know very definitely, that there is no alternative to dialogue or resolution of such difficult problems.
I mean, as I was saying before to Mr. Ali, peacekeeping operations is something that Bangladesh has been rather associated with. Do you see that sort of wider regional role and contribution as something that your country is going to pursue further?
Well, absolutely. The way we look at it is that it does have merit. It has helped. We have had peacekeepers. There still are peacekeepers in many countries. Now, almost entirely, mainly in Africa. But in other places as well, like in Lebanon, some other countries. And I think by and large, they have acquitted themselves well. And in fact, I can tell you that whenever I meet either the UN Secretary General or one of his deputies, especially the one who is responsible for UN peacekeeping operations, they are always asking Bangladesh for additional women police officers. Mm-hmm. So that is something that's a commodity which is in short supply in Bangladesh itself, mm-hmm. because we, although we are increasing the recruitment of women police officers, Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina is absolutely open for women to all professions, including even infantry. And just a few months ago, we had 2 women army officers who qualified as paratroopers. So therefore, they are doing quite well. I think they are serving their purpose, and now even their functioning is under constant review. India is a major player, and we are all in it together. So we are doing our bit. This is helping the cause of say pacification, or whatever way you term it, to bring peace. And also, in addition, I must also mention that in countries like Sierra Leone, like Guinea, Our peacekeepers have also taught them, set up schools. They have taught them agricultural practices. They have shown actually in many of these countries they did not have rice crops, so they have planted rice, and even some vegetables with which they are not accustomed.
I wonder if I could take one of your points and just turn to Professor Pangastu, because of course I know that you also have a distinguished career in questions of human development, and actually the gender issue as part of security and human security has become a much more major part of the way in which states and organizations think about prosperity and development. Do you see that as a positive story in the Indo-Pacific region in the present and moving forward?
I mean the gender equality issue?
Yes, in terms of women are now more able to be autonomous consumers, they're more in the workforce, their engagement in particularly with high technology work and so forth is at a level that it wouldn't have been 30 or 20 years ago. There is a sort of gender agenda, so to speak, there that is certainly part of the economic prosperity of the region.
Well, I would say there's progress, but there's still a lot more homework to be done. I'm glad to be, this is not a manel, what manel is? Man-only panel. So there's progress here in Davos. And I think that the other day there was a whole women panel. But I mean, in the last session that I was in this morning, we were talking exactly about this issue. And the numbers are showing that, okay, there's greater participation of women in the labor force, but it's still lower than men. For same job, it's still lower pay. So there's this huge opportunity. I mean, I forgot the numbers, but they had all these numbers. If you actually could utilize the potential for women as an economic resource, you could actually add 10% more to growth and so on. Now, and you have to start with girls. It starts with the education of the girls.
Now that's a great takeaway from the session. Actually, that's a very clear and very provocative statistic, which is good to have there. Any last? Yes, gentlemen. I don't know if you have any gender mixed quick comments from the audience, but we seem to be having your men answer questions too. But go ahead, sir. Who are you?
Thank you very much. I'm Fyodor Lukyanov from Russia. I would like to press a little bit the panel on the issue which has already been brought up. A couple of days ago, U.S. defense strategy has been published, which puts clearly and unequivocally that China is a strategic competitor of the United States in all terms, first of all, military terms. What people, nation in Asia will make out of it? Maybe it's good for you, because the United States will, at the end, extend some kind of guarantees against Chinese rise and Chinese pretty aggressive behavior in many areas. Are you happy about this happening, or are you afraid that Asia again? And Minister said one thing which struck me, because being from Europe, I never thought that Cold War was actually not the real Cold War for most of the world except Europe.
Thank you for an excellent question. It will be our last question, but it's a very good one to go out on. If I could start again, perhaps with Professor Pangastu about the US role. I mean, and of course, coming up against China as a strategic rival, how does it look from Jakarta?
Well, I think we always play, the balance between China and the US. So maybe in this sense, it's a good balance again. It's rebalancing again. But I think we are still uncertain how to deal with the US on the economic side, because it's always linked to the security side. So, like the deal.
When you say the US, do you mean the current administration?
Yes, the current administration of the US, and we still think that at the end of the day, this deal-making kind of approach that the US has adopted, it's not just in the economic sense, but also in the security sense. So we're still a bit ambivalent about that. But I think the balance is there, and we would add in the Indo-Pacific as the other balance. And at the moment, actually, the opportunity is more from the non-US side to get cooperation on the infrastructure and so on for the benefit.
Thank you for that. And the view from Dhaka, Minister?
On this?
I mean, is it something you feel that actually is a problem for Bangladesh, an opportunity, or it doesn't matter very much, the strategic rivalry between the US and China, which is certainly emerging?
Well, I don't know really whether there is a true rivalry, because
I think there is actually.
China is holding so much, running into trillions of US Treasury bonds. So I don't see. And then if China stops, or asks for the money back, you know, there will be big trouble over there.
So we may look to the bankers to save us in that case. And strategic rival in the region, obviously India has views on this question, Minister.
You know, I can't think of a time since 1945 when America has not had a very powerful strategic presence in this region. So there is nothing extraordinarily new about America taking a position or nuancing its positions and so on. But one thing we do know, and once again I would like to assert that, which is that any nation's development, any nation's progress is going to be an indigenous process. A nation will grow on its own capacities, own capabilities, own merits, and own ambitions.
And you're speaking of China in that context?
I'm speaking certainly of my country, and I speak of that as a principle, which I hope is applicable to everyone else.
Including China, no doubt, and no doubt the United States as well. We've had a fantastic panel, and I'd like you, if you would, to thank our speakers for so much food for thought. Minister M.J. Akbar, Minister Abul Hassan Mahmoud Ali, and Professor Mari Elka Pangestu. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.